The Ultimate Leap by Penny Jeffrey.
Theorizing that one could time travel within his own lifetime, Dr. Sam Beckett stepped into the quantum leap accelerator and vanished. He awoke to find himself trapped in the past, facing mirror images that were not his own, and driven by an unknown force to change history for the better. His only guide on this journey is Al, an observer from his own time, who appears in the form of a hologram that only Sam can see and hear. And so Dr. Beckett finds himself leaping from life to life, striving to put right what once went wrong, and hoping each time that his next leap will be the leap home.
August 12th, 1999. It was a peaceful feeling. In fact, it was very similar to what he experienced in between leaps. Yet he was still unable to make use of all his 5 senses. Did that mean he hadn't arrived at his destination? Dr. Sam Beckett started to panic a little, wondering if perhaps this time he wouldn't wake up ever again and would remain floating in time and space for all eternity. Then he heard a faint beeping sound, and something told him it was an ECG monitor. He also realised the pauses in between the beeps were very far apart, so whoever was hooked up to the machine was quite ill, as it was recording their very weak heartbeat. He opened his eyes and realised he was staring straight up into fluorescent lighting, which made him blink considerably, so his pupils could adjust to the glare. He looked to the left of himself, saw the monitor, and immediately noticed the barely visual heart rate displayed on the screen. He then realised it was his own heart, or rather the person's with whom he'd swapped places in time with. Becoming more aware of his surroundings, he now knew where he was. I'm in a hospital. Other sounds penetrated his ears, and he noticed he was hooked up to a life support machine. This was serious. Whoever he'd leaped into must be gravely ill. Maybe he'd been involved in some kind of accident. So I'm here to revive the patient and make him well again. Sam sat up, swung his legs over the bed and got onto his feet. After all, he wasn't ill. But the poor guy in the waiting room would need all the expert medical attention he could get from his colleagues on the Quantum Leap project. Maybe that's why he'd leaped, so this person could get the best treatment modern technology could give, that he couldn't receive in his own time, whenever that was. Looking to his right, he noticed a small shaving mirror on top of a bedside cabinet and was just about to pick it up so he could see the person's image, when suddenly a door appeared in the room and slid open, revealing an interior of bright light. Sam smiled and waited for his friend Al to greet him and fill him in on what was happening. A few minutes passed, and no one came out the door, much to Sam's surprise and slight annoyance. "Al, if this is a joke, then ha-ha, very funny," he said flatly. Still nobody showed themselves, and the door remained open. "Al," he shouted, "what are you playing at?" There was no answer from his friend. Sam frowned and continued to stare into the light. Almost at once he felt a sudden, powerful urge to enter through the doorway. "That's absurd," he told himself. "It's the hologrammatic door, so I'll just walk straight through it." Even his Swiss cheese brain remembered that much. Still, as he spoke, he felt compelled towards it. He took several steps forward and found himself in the doorway. Filled with a mixture of doubt as well as curiosity, Sam stepped inside. If he'd turned round at that point, he would probably have received the shock of his life, for there lying on the hospital bed was the man he'd leaped into, still hooked up to the life support machine that was keeping him alive. Sam had never realised that when he got up and walked toward the door that had appeared, he was no longer hooked up to the life support machine. The man in the bed looked extremely pale, and his heartbeat had slowed down considerably, so much so that it was barely audible on the ECG. Everything pointed to the fact that he was very close to death. To Sam's complete astonishment, he discovered he'd walked into an intensely bright light. Where the heck was the intensive care room? He was supposed to have walked straight through back into the hospital again, but he hadn't. Instead, he was surrounded in light. For one brief, hopeful second, he thought he was home, but that soon passed when he remembered the fluorescent lighting in the imaging chamber had never been this bright, ever. So what on earth was happening to him? Sam started to become very worried and swallowed hard. This was unlike anything he'd ever experienced on one of his leaps. Just then the door to the future appeared, taking Sam by complete surprise. Hadn't he just walked through it? A few moments later, Al Calavici stepped out, a concerned look etched on his face. Sam noticed this and began to worry even more. Al, what's going on? I don't understand. Neither did Ziggy at first, Al replied, the tone of his voice matching the look he was giving his friend. Sam, we've been working overtime trying to find you. Sam interrupted the Admiral, confused. What do you mean you've spent ages trying to find me? It's only been several minutes or so since I got here. Obviously, during this leap, the physicist had forgotten a part of his theory on time travel, so Al reminded him. Don't you remember, time passes differently for us than it does for you? No, Sam replied. Well, anyway, we couldn't fathom out why Ziggy was taking so long in pinpointing you. I mean, you leaped into 1999 at first. Al hesitated, stared at the hand link, then knocked it against his side, causing it to squeal in protest. Sam's eyes widened with excitement. I leaped into my own year? He paused and his look changed to a frown. Al, what do you mean, at first? Where am I now? It's not very easy to explain, Al replied, tapping the keypad on the hand link and rechecking Ziggy's information was correct. He couldn't believe what he was reading. That's impossible. Sam was becoming more and more impatient. What's impossible? Al, what the hell is going on? He stopped to think for a brief moment, then carried on while the Admiral continued to give the jumble of cubes in his hand a firm knock, causing it to shriek most indignantly. Al, I walked through the door. He stopped to allow a brief wave of emotion to pass over him. I thought I was home. The Admiral closed his eyes for a second. How he wished he could say to him, Yes, Sam, you're home, but that would not be the truth. Instead he shook his head solemnly. It wasn't the door to the chamber you walked through, Sam. Dr. Beckett looked very puzzled. Then whose door was it? The reason Ziggy took a while to find you, Al carried on, was because we discovered the man you leaped into is in a coma, very close to death. Al, what the heck are you saying? Sam asked nervously. I'm saying... He paused and looked down at the hand link. Well, actually, this information I've just received is telling me that you leaped in just as the guy's spirit was leaving its earthly body. Al replied, finding it rather difficult to believe what he was telling his friend. You kind of, merged with his soul. I kind of what? Sam, you're in a state of limbo. The lights on the hand link flashed in some sort of sequence, then it bleeped a few times. Al stared at it in astonishment. According to Ziggy, you're on the border between life and death. Dr. Sam Beckett could not believe what Al was trying to explain to him. This was all too crazy for words, but he still managed to utter a shocked, "Oh boy." Sam took several deep breaths in order to steady himself after receiving the news of his whereabouts. Al was right. It was impossible to believe he was no longer on Earth, but trapped in limbo. He stared all around him, but there was no structure as such that he could make out. just a very bright light. Sam began to pace up and down on what, he wasn't quite sure. It certainly didn't feel like a solid floor. He turned and faced the Admiral, who was in the process of knocking 7 bells out of the hand link. "How did I get here?" The tension in his voice was very prominent, but at the same time there was also a subdued hint of excitement. Well, he was a scientist, an explorer of the mind and its infinite possibilities. His whole reason for existing was to try and understand the wonders of creation. How many people got the chance to find the answers regarding the afterlife? Suddenly a chill ran through every nerve fibre in his body. Was he here because he was dead? "Ziggy doesn't have enough data to give you a clear answer," Al replied with a confused look. "All she keeps repeating is that you're in a state of limbo." "Then that must be it," Sam whispered, feeling very afraid. Albert Calavici sensed the physicist's bout of fear, and he too felt rather nervous. "What must be?" he asked quietly. "Ask Ziggy." He paused and closed his eyes briefly. "What are the chances of the experiment going completely wrong, and therefore causing my own termination?" Al looked horrified. "Sam, that's not funny." "I'm not being funny," the scientist said sharply. "Just ask her, will you?" "OK." Al punched a few buttons on the keypad, not wishing to know the computer's answer, just in case everything had totally screwed up. There was a gentle wail from the device in his hand. He looked down at the screen and then across at his friend. "You're not exactly dead. You're suspended between life and death." Sam was relieved to hear that at least he wasn't dead, but even so this was still a strange, if not alarming, place to be stuck. He looked at the hologram of the Admiral. "Al, you've got to find out why I'm here so I can do whatever I've been sent to do, then leave." His mind revered back to the hospital room he'd found himself in before he'd walked through the strange door. Who did I leap into? Find out any background information you have on the guy. Why is he in a coma? Maybe if I knew that, we could figure a way to get him out of it. "I'll find some answers somehow," Al replied, trying to sound convincing. "I'll take Ziggy apart if I have to." Even though it was a worrying situation to be in, Sam managed to smile. Then an important question suddenly dawned on him. "How on earth did you find me?" The quantum physicist was extremely grateful to his best friend and the rest of the project for working out exactly where he was, even though, strictly speaking, it wasn't on the planet Earth. "I'm not sure," was Al's weak reply. "I mean, I entered the imaging chamber after Ziggy sent me in on the hospital." He changed the subject. "Incidentally, you were in Mercy Hospital, Los Angeles." "In my own time?" "Then I was roughly 800 miles away from Stallion's Gate, New Mexico." "The project?" Al lowered his head. "Approximately, yes, you were." The Admiral bit his lip and cursed silently. It didn't seem fair that Sam should have leaped in so close to home, only to have then been sent to the spirit world. He only hoped the computer and the personnel on the Quantum Leap project could get him back, somehow. He returned to what he'd originally been trying to explain to Sam, only he knew it wouldn't be much help. "Ziggy must have miscalculated and zeroed me in on limbo land instead." Sam Beckett frowned. "How is that possible?" "What do you mean?" "I doubt very much Ziggy has records on the afterlife in her databanks, so how could she send your image here?" The hologram shook his head and shrugged. "I don't know." The physicist continued his line of reasoning with, "I created Ziggy as a scientific experiment that would rely on factual information, not fantasy, psychic phenomenons, Ouija boards, tarot cards, ghosts and things that go bump in the night." Al muttered, not really quite knowing how to react. Then the hand link emitted a few squeaks. "What does Ziggy say?" Sam asked, hoping the computer had a resolute answer. "She says the fact is you're in limbo." Al breathed heavily in annoyance. "Gee, that's a great help." Dr. Beckett started to pace once more. There had to be a logical explanation for all this. There just had to be. Then again, what was logical about being in limbo? Absolutely nothing whatsoever as far as he could see. Sam was just beginning to feel completely out of his depth when an idea came to him. He whirled around and walked up to the Admiral, almost stepping through him. "We know Ziggy isn't fully responsible for my leaps, is she?" he asked, wanting reassurance he was right in his statement. That's correct," Al replied, taking several steps backwards so as to avoid contact. He still wasn't used to people walking through him, unless, of course, she happened to be an attractive young lady. But we're not exactly sure who is responsible for your leaping around in time. Sam allowed the corners of his mouth to turn up just slightly. I think I do know now. He looked at his holographic friend, then added, It's God. The Admiral couldn't remember the last time Sam had resorted to a religious explanation. Usually he had a scientific justification for almost everything. That's one theory, he conceded. No, don't you see, Al? It was all starting to become clear for Sam. I'm here, on the borderline between life and death. I'm in his waiting room, if you like. Al nodded, even though he didn't fully understand. Albert Calavicci had never been a strongly religious man after his father Guido had died of cancer. He'd begged night and day for him to recover, but his prayers were never answered. That was when he lost his faith, until an incident occurred during a time Sam leaped into the body of a priest. Al remembered hearing 3 gunshots as he'd stepped out of the door and seeing Sam lying in the aisle of the chapel. He'd crouched down and tried to hold him, but because it was a hologram, his arms had passed right through his friend. In the end, he'd knelt by Sam's side and prayed the scientist wasn't dead. That prayer had been answered, much to his relief, so maybe there was a God who listened. Perhaps he was also in charge of Sam's leaps. So you're in his waiting room and the guy in the coma is in ours? I guess so, Sam replied. I'll go back and find out who the guy is. Surely Ziggy will have a profile on him, and then at least we'll know why he's comatose. OK. Al pressed the keypad and the door to the future appeared. Stepping inside, he turned and looked back at his friend. Hang in there, Sam. I'll be back as soon as I can. The door closed, leaving Sam alone in a strange place unfamiliar to him. Still, he had to believe he was in safe hands. Looking up into the light, he cried, Why am I here, God? What is it you want me to do? Please tell me. The Quantum Leap Laboratory lay deep in the heart of central New Mexico, buried beneath a vast area of desert. It had been there now for over 4 years, ever since Dr. Beckett had given the go-ahead to lay the foundations of his scientific dream in the early 1990s. Looking at it from the outside, one would have been fooled into thinking it was a mountain of rocks, viewed from a considerable distance. On closer inspection, it did have a rather unnatural appearance, which proved it was man-made. Underneath approximately 150 feet of earth were a number of rooms on various levels, connected to one another by elongated hexagon-shaped corridors, which could be reached by several elevators. The airlock doors slid upwards, and Admiral Albert Calavicci walked from the buffer zone straight into the pulsating heart of the project, the central control room. This was a large, spacious area dominated by a version of the hand link 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. Above hung a blue and silver ball which seemed to be suspended in mid-air. The rest of the room was taken up with bits of Ziggy, who kept complete records of just over 40 years' worth of the world's history. 50 feet below the room were the design officers, the guts of the main computer. Gushy, who was standing behind the multi-hued table of cubes, intercepted Al, somewhat concerned. Admiral, how can Dr. Beckett be trapped between heaven and hell? That's a good question, Al replied a little proudly. The head programmer was the only member of the team who dressed him in such a manner. It gave him a sense of purpose and a feeling of authority. I only wish we had an answer, he added, somewhat dumbfounded. So much for being in charge. He looked up and faced the kaleidoscope of various shades of the colour blue that were emanating from the centre of the now illuminated silver ball that hung in mid-air above him. Ziggy? Yes, Admiral, came the soft, almost sensual feminine tones. Al had sometimes pictured the computer as a flesh-and-blood woman, tall, sexy, and someone who had the annoying habit of never experiencing any guilt feelings, while at the same time always believing she was right about everything. No, having a real woman like that would almost certainly drive him crazy. Actually, Ziggy had already managed to do just that on numerous occasions. Once he'd almost taken a wrench to her. Oh, it had been so very tempting, but it would have been lethal for Sam. He smirked. If Sam ever did come back, he'd take the computer down a peg or two. I'd like a complete profile on the guy Sam's leaped into. There was a brief pause, then Ziggy spoke with an air of indifference. His name is Andrew Lomax, 47 years old, and at present he is in a deep coma in Mercy Hospital, Los Angeles, California, in the year 1999. Al glared at the pulsating patter. Yes, we all know that. Gushy corrected the Admiral slightly. At least we have a name, and we know how old he is now. I suppose we should be grateful for that. Al winced a little. All right, but do we know anything about his background? Ziggy pondered a while. That is all the information I have at present, Admiral. I will require more time if I am to gain any further input, as I am still in the process of running through Mr. Lomax's past history. Well, could you possibly speed things up? I was getting rather irritated. He faced Gushy. As soon as Ziggy comes up with anything else, let me know. I'm going to find Dr. Beeks to see if there's any change in the waiting room. He didn't wait for a reply and left the control room in a huff. Sam Beckett knelt down, hands gently clasped together, and concentrated hard on each breath he took. What was this form of relaxation called? From out of the depths of his consciousness came the words Tai Chi. It was a method that had been taught to him by a Chinese master who had trained him in the art of self-defence. He must only have been in his early 20s when he'd started those martial arts classes. As far as he knew, he'd eventually become a sensei, a master in the arts of Sabat, Muay Thai, Karate and Jiu-Jitsu. It had stood him in good stead in previous leaps. However, right now he needed to keep calm and level-headed, and pray the Lord God Almighty he knew what he was doing. I'm sorry, Sam whispered. I shouldn't have let those thoughts come into my head just now. I beg your pardon. There was no answer, but then he hadn't really expected a reply. Once again he looked around, only to see an intense light. At least it didn't hurt his eyes like those strobes had done in the hospital. But time was passing far too slowly, and he decided if something didn't happen soon he'd go nuts. "Ow, where are you?" he muttered under his breath. No sooner had he spoken when he thought he could see shadows moving, beginning to form and emerge from the light all around him. Oh boy, now I'm hallucinating due to the loneliness. Wait a moment. They were coming closer, and they were no longer abstract shapes, but figures, groups of people. I'm not alone, Sam said, rather relieved. He stood up and beckoned them toward him. Hello, he greeted, uncertain as to how he should address these formations. That received no response, so he tried a friendly wave. Unfortunately, this seemed to have no desired effect either. He noticed these strangers were completely transparent, as he could see straight through them. Each one had a pale, gaunt look as they passed by him, totally ignoring the quantum physicist. Mesdames. Sam understood what those French words meant. Lost soul. They must be lost souls, he told himself, feeling a wave of pity for the spirits, who for some reason had no heaven or even a hell to go to. If only I could free them, help them as I do the people I meet during my leaps. But how? How could he assist tormented souls trapped in a state of non-existence, while at the same time being aware of life? Perhaps he thought they performed an injustice while spending their time on earth, and this was their punishment for all the wrongdoing they'd caused. Or maybe they hadn't believed in an afterlife. If you didn't think a heaven or hell existed, then how would you find it when you'd passed on? Sam Beckett had no definite answers to all these questions, but all the same felt sorry these poor souls had to be in this state. He watched them as they disappeared back into the light, then tried to return to his meditation. Almost as soon as he'd closed his eyes, he heard a very faint sound which made him open them. He focused on a small figure curled up on the floor. It was a young girl, and he could tell she was upset. Full of concern, he walked over and knelt down beside her. He noticed she wasn't transparent like the others. She looked more like a person of flesh and blood, like himself, so would he be able to comfort her? Gently he placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and discovered that he could touch her. Hey, he said softly, it's okay. A sarcastic thought entered his mind. Oh, sure. It was just wonderful to be in a place like this. The girl remained where she was, softly weeping into her hands. Even though he couldn't see her face, he could tell she was a sweet child. She had long auburn hair which fell about her shoulders in large ringlets, and wore a pale blue cotton dress with a pink sash around her waist. On her feet were white ankle socks and blue patent leather shoes. He guessed she must be only 6 or 7 years old. Poor kid. How had she ended up here? Sam tried again. I'm not going to hurt you, sweetheart, he said, trying to offer reassurance. There was still no response, so Sam gathered her into a warm embrace and rocked her gently. Please don't cry, he whispered, feeling a wave of emotion creeping up on him. The tears began to glisten in his eyes, and he held her a little tighter. In answer, the girl put her arms around him and cried into his shoulder. I'll help you. I swear I'll help you, honey, he promised her. After a while, she looked up and a large smile spread across her face. Daddy, she cried. Oh, Daddy! Sam looked puzzled. What had she called him? Daddy? Then it dawned on him. He'd leaped into the girl's father, or rather the spirit of the girl's father. He was lying in hospital in a coma, severely ill. This leap was getting more and more complicated by the minute. Where on earth was Al with all the relevant information he needed? In the Project Quantum Leap's waiting room, Dr. Beckett's body lay motionless on a bed, surrounded by 4 walls that pulsated in a bluish hue. Standing over him was Admiral Calavici and Dr. Verbena Beeks. Even though he was dressed in the usual bright clothes, this time his favourite shocking red suit with tie to match, Verbena had donned the white uniform required as standard dress code for all project personnel while on duty, except, of course, for Al. The psychiatrist had her fingers on Sam's wrist, while Albert watched, puffing on his cigar anxiously. His pulse is so weak, she stated, a concerned look on her face. It's almost as if he wants to die. Al stared at the near-lifeless body. He always found it an uneasy experience when he saw the scientist's features, yet knew it wasn't really him. Maybe this guy Lomax wishes to, but I know very well Sam Beckett doesn't. He took the cigar out of his mouth and twirled it nervously between fingers and thumb. But if this guy does give up, then we've lost Sam for good. A voice sounded out over the intercom, timid but rather excitable like a chipmunk. Admiral, it was Gooshy. Ziggy has the profile you requested. Thank heavens for small mercies. Al gave a slight smile in Verbena's direction, then left the waiting room. He'd been feeling helpless regarding Sam's situation. Maybe now he'd be able to work out why Dr. Beckett was in the predicament he was in. One could always hope. Dr. Beckett held the little girl closer to his chest and stroked her hair. Right at that moment he felt completely helpless himself. All right, he knew he was her father, but who was she, and why was she in limbo with him? All he could think was that she'd died in some way and couldn't be at peace. That made him feel very sad indeed. He heard the sound of metal sliding against metal and knew it had to be the door of the imaging chamber. Looking up with anticipation, he saw Al step out. Sam grinned when he noticed the attire his friend was in. You should be downstairs for wearing a suit like that, he said, pointing below. Pardon, Daddy? The little girl's sobbing had ceased, and now she looked bewildered. I see we've still got our sense of humour, Al remarked. He took a look around the barren white area. I can see why you need it. Sam turned his attention to the girl and thought of a way to include Al in the conversation without sounding completely insane. Oh, honey, I have a friendly angel who only I can see and hear. The observer walked over to them and smiled down at the girl. Oh, she's the little angel around here. Taking the hand link out of his pocket, he pressed a key and read out the information displayed on the small screen. Her name is, or rather was, Angela Lomax. She was only 6 years old when... He stopped and stifled a sniffle. Apparently she was killed when her father accidentally knocked her down. What? How? Sam asked, his voice quavering a little. Angela stared at him. Why are you so sad? What does the angel say to you? It's all right, sweetheart, he replied, trying not to show the tears he could feel welling up inside. As Al continued to read out the tragic tale, he too felt remorseful. It seems Angela was playing in the garden of her home. She heard her father come out of the house. He was saying goodbye to her mother, as he did every day before he left for work. Al paused, then added, Andrew Lomax was married to Jennifer Steadwell, a British air stewardess who he met in California during one of her flights over to LA. He also has a job as a sales... At that precise moment, the sentences decided to stick. Al was in no mood for this and angrily tapped the device, to which it responded with a squeal in a high-pitched tone. A sales rep for a large computer firm. So how did it happen? Sam asked, wishing Ziggy would arrive at the most important part. The observer continued. He went into the garage to start up the car, a Testarossa Ferrari. Ow! Sam yelled. Get to the point. Angel Al? Angela asked curiously. Yes, honey. It's not my fault, Al complained, giving the handlink a hefty swipe. As usual, it screeched in equal protest. He continued reading the information. The little girl was unaware of the danger and followed her father. The mother had gone back inside, so she didn't realise Angela was heading for the garage. She ran across the drive just as her father was backing out the vehicle. She died instantly. Sam closed his eyes, allowing a tear to course down his cheek. The little girl took hold of his hand, a look of concern on her pretty face. Daddy, please don't cry. You're here with me now. The physicist squeezed her hand gently, managed to smile and looked across at his holographic friend, who also seemed rather forlorn. Do you have any news about the guy in the hospital? He referred to Andrew. That was so Angela wouldn't know he was talking about her father. Al looked at the screen and gave a heavy sigh. Andrew Lomax tried to take his own life after he got divorced from his wife, who couldn't cope with the tragedy. His life became a mess, and he ended up in a coma in Mercy Hospital. He never forgave himself for what happened, Sam asked quietly under his breath. He looks that way, Al replied. Then he had an idea. Maybe he wants his daughter's forgiveness. It might help him let go of the hate and guilt that's buried so deep inside, and Sam interrupted him. And he's keeping her here in limbo? Then he added, Al, I know why I'm here. To free the little girl's soul so she can finally be at peace, Al told him, already aware the scientist was thinking along those same lines. Yes. Angela looked confused. Daddy, why are you talking so funny? Sam lifted her head and kissed her softly on the cheek. Honey, you don't want to stay in this place forever, do you? No, she whispered. I felt so lonely and lost, but now you're here. Sam glanced at the hologram. Do I tell her, Al? I think in this case you should. What? Angela asked. Daddy, what do you want to tell me? Dr. Beckett took a deep breath and let it out slowly. How do you tell the spirit of a 6-year-old you're a scientist from the future who experimented with time travel? Then again, the innocent mind of a young child is full of imagination. They believe in Santa Claus and fairies at the bottom of the garden, and this poor little mite was even aware of the spirit world. It couldn't be that difficult to explain. Angela, I'm not your father. The little girl looked puzzled. But you look like my daddy. Sam sighed. Yes, I know I do, but I'm not him. He's in the hospital, very sick. Honey, I know he wants you to forgive him. For what? She asked, then added, Oh, yes. The accident that sent me here. Sam nodded. I'm here to help you, honey. Angela smiled and gazed up into his eyes. You're another angel? Dr. Beckett looked at Al, who grinned and shrugged his shoulders. He turned back to Angela. Well, yes, I guess I am, kind of. What's your name? Sam. That's a nice name for an angel, she replied sweetly. Thanks. He gave her an affectionate hug. Suddenly the hand link began to squeal like a cat caught in a tumble dryer, shattering the tranquil moment. What the... Al tapped several buttons on the abstract keypad and his face fell. Sam noticed immediately and stood up quickly, nearly knocking the little girl over. What's the matter, Sam? She asked nervously, getting to her feet. Angel Al is about to explain. He walked over to the hologram. Well, he asked, concerned. Not satisfied with the information he'd just received, the observer performed the ritual of bashing the hand link several times. This can't be right, he said, frustrated. What? Sam exclaimed. It keeps reading life's up. Sam Beckett panicked. What do you mean by life's up? He didn't wait for an answer. Oh, my God, it's the hospital. The scientist suddenly had disturbing visions of being trapped in between life and death forever. My daddy, Angela said with a worried expression. In his panic, he'd forgotten the little girl. Oh, honey, I'm sorry. He took hold of her hand. The Admiral tried to calm things down. No, Sam, I didn't mean your life is up. It says here, L-I-F-E-S-U-P, he spelled out. So unless Ziggy's forgotten how to spell, I don't think it means what you just said. Sam frowned, considering. Life
"Sup?" he queried. "And what else does Ziggy say?" "Is my daddy all right?" Angela asked, concerned. "Who's Ziggy?" Dr. Beckett squeezed her hand gently. "Everything is going to be all right." Then he quickly added, "Ziggy's another angel." "Yeah," Hall replied moodily. "An angel that needs a good kick up the ow," Sam snapped. "Just find out what it means, okay?" The Admiral punched out a code on the keypad and shook the hand link rather fiercely. "Come on, you stupid piece of junk," he said, exasperated. "Don't break down on me now." The device emitted a piercing squeak, and Sam glanced despairingly at the ground until he heard the Admiral's cry of relief. "Aha! Got it! It says..." "Uh-oh. Uh-oh, what?" Sam retorted angrily. He disliked the phrase Al used, as it almost always spelled disaster. "It says life support machine," Al added hastily. "Gosh, he sent to me on Mercy Hospital, 1999. "Ow, wait!" Sam cried, but it was too late. In a second, the hologram had vanished from sight. "You and Angel Al don't seem to get along very well," Angela stated. "Do you always fight?" "Oh, constantly," Sam replied. "That's why we're such good buddies." Then he remembered Al's sudden exit. It was something to do with the life support machine keeping Lomax alive, and in doing so was keeping him alive as well. The fact the hologram had disappeared with a very concerned look on his face made Sam think something serious was happening back on Earth. He turned to embrace the little girl once more. "Al's gone to sort a few things out, honey, but he'll be back. He won't let us down," he told her, while at the same time trying to reassure himself. The City of Angels was in the middle of an almost tropical heat wave, or so it felt to the millions of inhabitants who lived there. For many it was a time to be carefree and lazy, to spend hours soaking up the high temperature on sun-kissed beaches all along the coast. But for the busy doctors and nurses at Mercy Hospital in the centre of Los Angeles, there was no time for leisure. The place itself felt like the interior of an oven, even though the air conditioning was operating on full power throughout the building. The staff continuously wiped perspiration from their brows and endured the uncomfortable feeling of uniforms practically sticking to their skins while they carried out normal, hectic, everyday duties. In one of the intensive care units, lying in between the sheets of a hospital bed, was a severely ill young man. He'd slipped into a coma after attempting suicide by overdosing on a mixture of alcohol and barbiturates. Beside him, seated on a stool, was a young blonde woman dressed in the uniform of an air hostess. 1 hour ago she'd arrived at LAX airport after flying from Paris. During this particular journey, her thoughts had been primarily about her ex-husband, Andrew. His parents had discovered which airline she was working for and had telephoned her in Europe to explain the terrible news. Now she was here in the hospital, staring down at the man who had once been a special part of her life. Her crystal blue eyes were glazed as she gripped one limp hand tightly while stroking his jet-black curls with her free hand. At first she'd felt it was her duty to see him, but now things were completely different, especially since the doctor had explained the whole situation. Now she had a painful decision to make. Jennifer Steadwell shivered a little and closed her eyes, a tear beginning to trace its way down her cheek. She couldn't help but hear the ECG monitor and be aware of the barely audible tiny blips that were so far apart. "I left because I just couldn't handle our daughter's death," she said sadly. "I know I blamed you, but I was wrong, Andrew. So terribly wrong." She leaned closer and laid her head on his chest. "Darling, I love you," she whispered. Then the tears began to flow uncontrollably. At that moment, the door to the intensive care room opened. Andrew's mother and father walked in, followed by the doctor. Jennifer looked up and caught the deeply anxious looks both parents were giving. "Have you made your decision?" she asked, voice faltering. Mrs. Lomax, a silver-haired lady in her late 60s, came over and rested her hand on the woman's shoulder. "Our son has been like this for so long now." She glanced at her husband, who was about the same age as she was, and then at the doctor. "Dr. Williams says there isn't likely to be any sign of recovery," she said, her voice sounding weak and strained. The young woman could tell they'd come to a conclusion, and without a word she hugged the older woman tightly. Al Calavici appeared in the room and immediately sensed an atmosphere full of pain and remorse. He scrutinised each person in turn, then noticed the one in the white uniform walking towards the life support machine, a sombre look on his face. "Oh no!" the observer exclaimed, but of course no one could hear him. Panicking, his fingers flew over the keypad in a desperate attempt to contact Ziggy. In his hurry, he pressed the wrong combination and received a set of question marks on the calculator-sized screen. "Oh, for Christ's sake!" Angrily, he thumped the handlink and tried again. "Ziggy, what's the chance they're going to switch off the machine?" In response, the handlink gave a long wail and several squeals. The observer read the data on the screen and his eyes widened in shock. "You predict an 82.6% possibility?" He thought quickly and added, "What happened to Andrew Lomax in the original history?" He punched 3 of the coloured keys and waited for a reply. The screen flashed up more information and Al's heart sank even further. Oh my God! He died when they switched off the life support. He avoided reading the rest. The Admiral had never been so completely helpless as he felt at that moment. How the hell can I stop them? I'm a hologram. They can't see or hear me. Al resigned to the fact that this was one time he could do nothing to save Sam. Knew it was all up to the powers that be now. "Sam, you can't die. Please, God, don't let him die," he begged. Mr. Lomax nodded to the doctor, though the pain he felt was tearing him up inside. "You can go ahead," he whispered. "No!" Al yelled with all his might. Dr. Williams raised one hand and rested an index finger on the main switch. "I'm really very sorry," he said, a grave look on his face. "No! No! No!" Al shouted again. He ran over in a desperate, impossible attempt to pull the man away from the machine. All he succeeded in doing was flailing his arms in the air, because each time he grabbed the guy, his projected image went straight through him. Jennifer's eyes were fixed on the doctor's hand. She could tell he was hesitating as his finger tapped gently against the switch. The lifeline that was keeping the man she loved dearly alive. A flick of the wrist and he would be gone from her forever. Maybe if she believed hard enough, there might still be a chance. She stood up abruptly. "No, wait!" she cried. "Leave it alone!" On hearing the woman's words, Al spun around and in doing so tripped and almost fell through the machine. After he'd steadied himself, he walked over to her. "Thank God," he breathed. "And thank you too." Now the element of panic was over, he took a really good look at her feminine features and liked what he saw. Andrew's a lucky guy. He knew what he'd said didn't completely ring true, as the poor guy was in a coma, but now there was a good chance he wouldn't be for long. Al checked the hand link. Correction, there was a 62% possibility of recovery. "Are you sure that's what you want?" the doctor asked. "Damn sure," Al replied firmly. Jennifer looked over toward Mr. and Mrs. Lomax, who both nodded in unison. She breathed a sigh of relief, then faced Dr. Williams. "We need more time to make a decision like this," she told him quietly. "Yeah, well, you won't have to," Al assured himself, then added, "Gushy, centre me on Sam." "I can't," came the head programmer's weak reply. The Admiral became alarmed once more. "What do you mean you can't?" "Ziggy has absolutely no idea how to return you to the spirit world," Gushy replied, tension audible in his voice. "Overgrown pocket calculator," Al muttered angrily. It was at that point he realised he was asking the wrong ally for assistance. Clasping his hands together, he lowered his head and prayed. "Dear Lord, please send me back to Sam. Amen." He waited for a response, but nothing happened. So he tried again, only with a different method. "Help!" he yelled. It seemed like many hours had passed since Sam had met the spirit of a little girl named Angela, perhaps even days. During that time they'd been left in complete solitude, lost in a void of bright light that was the waiting room between heaven and hell, between existence and non-existence. At least it gave him the chance to get to know his little friend. It had troubled him deeply when he'd learned the reason for her being sent to such a place because of a tragic accident caused by her father. Now his anger and guilt was not allowing him to let go of her memory, so she'd become trapped in limbo. Sam knew he'd been chosen to assist in the little girl's plight, and he wanted to help more now than ever. He had formed a very close bond with Angela, as she had with him. To her he was a celestial being in her father's image, sent by God to bring comfort into her heart. He decided not to mention Project Quantum Leap and let her believe he was indeed her guardian angel. He certainly felt like one. They'd been getting quite used to being alone, when from out of nowhere spirits of all shapes, sizes and ages suddenly began to appear. Sam smirked to himself. Now it was getting to be like Grand Central Station. Once more he realised he wasn't going to be able to communicate with them, and they didn't seem to show any interest in him or the little girl. "Nice crowd," he said sarcastically. Angela sighed. "They never seem to have any time for anyone." "It's probably rush hour," Sam joked, to which she gave him a sweet smile. It was then he felt a light tap on his shoulder. Turning round, he focused on a pair of bright, cat-like emerald eyes and full, pouting, ruby-red lips set in a creamy complexion. The woman smiled at the girl. "Hello, Angie." Then she looked closer at the man standing beside her. He was tall, with curly black hair and hazel eyes. An unusual combination, she thought. "And who is this heavenly body?" she asked, admiring his features. Sam was taken by surprise and raised his eyebrows, slightly embarrassed by her description of him, or should he say Andrew Lomax. Could it be possible this woman saw him as Sam and not the girl's father? But if that was the case, why couldn't Angela see him in his own guise, and did it really matter? Sam decided it was irrelevant. He also couldn't help noticing the older woman's features. She was about average height, slim, and dressed in a tight red dress that matched her long flowing locks. To put it simply, she was a very attractive person. "Hi," he stammered awkwardly. He always found he had a speech impediment every time a beautiful lady spoke to him, and it was most annoying. "Oh, this is Samantha," Angela told him. "She's the only one who does talk to me." "Uh-huh," Sam replied, unable to take his eyes off her. "Sam," Angela giggled, realising they both had the same name. "This is Sam, my guardian angel," she announced proudly. "Miss Samantha Bates," said the woman, fully introducing herself and flashing a dazzling smile.
"Pleased to meet you, Sam."
Dr. Beckett felt a little weak in the knees. How did you end up here?" he asked, trying to make polite conversation. "It's a long story, and believe me, it's very boring," Samantha replied nonchalantly. Gazing into his eyes, she added, "I'd much rather talk about you." Angela shrugged her shoulders. "Oh, she's always like this." Sam was just about to say, "Always like what?" when he heard a very familiar voice coming from behind him, and immediately recognised who it was. Who could mistake that deep, gravelly accent, so full of complete lust for the opposite sex? "Oh, wow!" the observer exclaimed, his eyes nearly popping out of his skull. "It's a redhead." He paused briefly, then added, "It's a dead redhead." Sam faced him, frowning. "Al, you're sick. And where the hell have you been?" "Who?" Samantha asked in surprise. "It's only Al, another angel," Angela replied. "More like a little imp," Sam added abruptly. "Where is he?" Samantha looked in all directions, but couldn't see anybody else paying any attention to them. "He's invisible," Angela said, "but he's here." "Oh, yes, I'm definitely here," I replied, giving the beautiful redhead with the green eyes a once-over from head to toe. "Gee, I wouldn't mind being stuck in limbo land with this long-legged, gorgeous creature. I mean, I'm sure I could think of a way to pass the time." He grinned, practically leering at the woman. "I'm sure you could," Sam retorted. "Could what? What's he saying?" Samantha asked, curious. "Believe me, you don't want to know." "Yes, she does," I replied, blowing kisses in her direction. "Al," Sam said sharply, "would you mind tearing yourself away for just 1 second so you can explain what's happening with Angela and me?" The little girl sensed her guardian angel wanted to discuss important matters with his friend, so she suggested she and Samantha leave them alone for a while. "See you later, Sam," the red-headed woman said sweetly, delivering a quick kiss on her cheek. "Bye, Al," she said, "wherever you are." "Yeah, see you," Sam replied. Then he glanced at the Admiral, who was almost drooling. "Ciao, gorgeous," Al called after her. He looked at the quantum physicist, who was giving him a very hard stare. "Oh, shucks, give me a break, Sam," Al complained when the two females had left. "You know, sometimes it's hard being a hologram, not being able to hold or to kiss," or he was starting to lose himself in an erotic vision and displayed a truly wicked grin. or caress, such a soft, sexy, supple, vibrant... All right, Dr. Beckett interrupted the Admiral's fantasy life. I just don't believe you, he added in an exasperated tone. I know it's your raison d'etre to chase every member of the female gender, but I never thought you'd lust after deceased women. Al Calavici gave a sly smile. She doesn't look that deceased to me. Sam glared at him. Well, she is, so can you try to show some respect, please? Oh, excuse me, Mr. Morals. That was Al's pet name for Sam, since he was such a saint. You seem pretty keen to see Miss What's-her-face, if you don't mind me saying so. Her name is Samantha Bates, Sam stated. And yes, it's nice to meet someone else who actually acknowledges your existence while you're stuck in limbo, but that doesn't mean I'm going to go ahead and seduce her on the spot. Oh, I would, Al replied, his eyes beginning to sparkle. Yes, we all know you would, but I won't. That's your problem. Al! Sam could see this conversation was going nowhere. Can we please change the subject? Like, for instance, what the heck happened at Mercy Hospital? Oh, that. The observer checked the hand link, then proceeded to take out one of his cigars from the top pocket of his jacket and lit it. Whenever you're ready, Sam said, his patience almost at an end. The hologram puffed on the cigar a few times, then noticed the look Sam was giving him. Hey, I deserve this, he exclaimed. You've no idea what I went through down there. That's right, I don't know, Sam said cuttingly. So, tell me. Al told him all about the incident that had occurred in the intensive care room and how it had been touch and go with the life support machine. When he'd finished, Sam realised he'd been rather harsh with his best friend. Thanks, Al. For what? For trying to stop them from turning off the machine before this Jennifer did stop them, I mean. Al shrugged. Like I said, it's tough being a hologram. The scientist smiled at him, then remembered the computer with the big ego. And Ziggy's sure they won't pull the plug now. The Admiral rechecked the hand link. She gives that an 88% probability. Sam breathed a heavy sigh of relief. At least that was one method of imprisoning him in the afterlife that had been nipped in the bud. However, he was still a far cry from freedom. Or was he? So what's going to happen to Andrew, he asked, hoping Ziggy would have some good news. A very rare concept in her case. Al pressed a few keys, then shook the hand link, causing the ever-familiar irate squeal. Ziggy says there's a 64.5% chance he will recover, but she has no idea how. She's got to know, Al. Sam was sounding very concerned. Angela has to be given the chance to forgive her father soon. It's not fair that she has to keep on suffering. Yeah, I know. Poor little soul, Al said sadly. Just then the hand link started to let out a sequence of electronic bleeps. Al stared at the gadget in his hand, and his look became one of astonishment. What is it? Sam asked curiously. The observer double-checked the information and blinked several times. According to this, you can go back. Sam felt very perplexed. Back where? Back to Earth, Al replied, equally confused. Sam frowned. How am I supposed to accomplish that? I'm trapped in limbo. It's not like I can beam down like they can on the Starship Enterprise. I haven't got the foggiest, Al said, resigned. Sam bit his lip anxiously. Well then, why don't we ask Ziggy? Good idea, Al replied with equal sarcasm, pressing several colour-coded keys on the hand link as he spoke. He stared blankly at the screen, then gave the gizmo a firm knock. The observer repeated the process several times before finally looking up at the scientist. Well, Sam asked, patience stretched to the limit. She says she's been given a new programme. Sam frowned. A new programme? Who from? The Admiral rechecked the hand link. She won't say. Wonderful, Sam said sharply. We have a computer that likes to keep secrets. Al gave a tiny smirk. She's your creation, Dr. Beckett. Sam shot him a filthy look. Oh, great, it's all my fault. He groaned inwardly. So now what? Curiosity had gotten the better of him, so Al decided to investigate the attractive redhead's life story. A number of squeaks came from the gizmo in his hand, and the hologram looked up at Sam, grinning like a Cheshire cat. Oh, boy. Oh, boy, what? Sam asked, puzzled. Al read out the data. Samantha Bates, born April 10th, 1960, died December 11th, 1988. Went into acting when she was 18 years old, did a couple of commercials. Sam cut him off sharply. I might have known you'd ask Ziggy for her profile. Al ignored him and carried on excitedly. She was also a star of Blue Movies and became known as... He stopped and gave a little snigger. Sam the Seductress. Oh, please, Sam Beckett winced. He thought for a moment about what Al had said regarding the woman's profession. Porn star, he said, grinning at the Admiral. Then how come you didn't recognise her? Huh? Oh, I just presumed you'd seen every single skin flick that's ever been released all over the entire world, Sam remarked. Not everyone, Al replied matter-of-factly. I let a few slip by. Just a few, the physicist said sarcastically. The observer refrained from his usual witty remarks and instead pushed a key on the pad. It seems she had a cardiac arrest while she was in the middle of a scene. Al paused and his eyes widened. Actually, she was in between two guys. Sam sighed. The stress must have been too much for her. Yeah, sex can be very energetic, Al added craftily. The quantum physicist shot him a dirty look. I meant the stress of having to resort to making those types of movies because you've no other way to make a living. Oh, sorry, Al said, feeling a bit guilty. I guess my imagination was getting out of hand. Sam ignored the last remark. So why is she stuck here? Al examined the handlink and frowned. Ziggy doesn't know. What else is new? Sam muttered under his breath. Then the Admiral noticed the two females were heading back towards them, so he gave a friendly wave in their direction. Even though he was aware they couldn't see his gesture, he felt it was still a sign of good manners to greet them. Why don't you ask Samantha? The tall, slim redhead walked right up to the two men, her eyes fixed on the physicist. Hello again, Sam, she cooed sweetly. Have you sorted things out with your invisible friend? Kind of, he replied, although he still had no idea how to get out of there. Angela looked all around the area. Why is he invisible? She asked curiously. Sam pondered on a believable answer, as the truth would be far too technical for a 6-year-old spirit to understand. Besides, he didn't feel up to explaining the Admiral was a phantasmic manifestation created by a subatomic agitation of carbon quarks who was tuned to the mesons of his optic and optic neurons. Wow, he thought. Surprised his Swiss cheese memory could remember all the scientific jargon. He smiled at the little girl. Oh, he's rather shy. He hardly ever appears to anyone. Al cocked one eyebrow cynically at the physicist. Gee, that's a good one, Sam, he said, cigar perched at the side of his mouth. Samantha, who hadn't taken her eyes off Dr. Beckett, decided to change the subject. Can we chat, Sam? She gave him a look that told him she wanted far more than just small talk. Angela perceived this and sighed. Oh, boy, Sam, don't you ever think about anything other than that? She asked, referring to the woman. Al couldn't resist the chance to speak out. He rarely ever thinks about that. This guy's the original Boy Scout, he announced. Sam Beckett shot him a look that said, if you weren't a hologram, I'd deck you. Samantha paid no attention to the girl, but instead stepped forward and delivered a powerful kiss on Sam's lips. This took him by surprise. Still, he couldn't help but find it a pleasing sensation, so he resisted the urge to pull away. Oh, brother, Angela put her hands over her eyes. Al, on the other hand, observed the two of them earnestly. Go for it, he urged. What a major discovery he'd made. It was possible to have sex in the afterlife. There is a God, he said with sheer relief. They parted and Samantha gazed longingly into Dr. Beckett's eyes. Do you know how long it's been since I've kissed a man? A while, Sam guessed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd kissed a woman. It felt so good, she said with a hint of passion. Yeah, it did, Sam agreed, but I don't think we should take it any further. What with me being an angel, he added quickly. Sam! Al exclaimed in disgust. Sometimes he just couldn't understand how a guy could be so completely innocent. Have you finished? Angela asked, peering through her fingers at them. Samantha gave a heavy sigh. I guess you're right. She looked over at the little girl and smiled. Yes, Angie, we're finished. Angela lowered her hands. Good, she announced. I hate all that mushy stuff. I wouldn't mind some mushy stuff, Al lamented. Sam flashed him a warning look, then he returned his attention to the redhead. He had a question for her. Samantha, why did you end up in this place? Is it because someone's anger or guilt is imprisoning you, as it did with Angela? The little girl looked at him and he gave her a warm smile. No, Samantha replied. She hesitated only slightly. It was my own fault. Sam stared at her. I don't understand. I guess I died while I was so full of anger. I hated my job and blamed everyone except myself for being in such dire straits. Her voice began to falter and tears welled up in her green eyes. It was my fault, and I realise that now. I was selfish. I threw all my money away on booze and drugs when I could have been successful. Sam felt a wave of sympathy wash over him, and he took the woman into his arms. If it's any consolation, he began, holding her gently, I know you'll go to heaven now. How do you know that? She asked, looking at him with tear-stained eyes. Because you've realised it was your own mistake, he replied softly. Angela came over to them and took the woman's hand. I'm glad you'll find peace, Sam, she said happily, but with a tinge of sadness. The beautiful redhead released herself from Dr. Beckett's embrace and hugged the little girl tightly. Thank you. The observer, who'd been watching the scene, was pleased to see that things were starting to work out, for Samantha at any rate. At that moment a squeal sounded out loud and clear from the hand link, and Sam looked across at him for answers. According to Ziggy, if you tell Angela about her father, you'll leap out of here, Al told him assuredly. Tell Angela what? Sam asked confused. Pardon, the little girl said. Then she realised who he was communicating with. Are you talking to Al? Yes, I am, honey. Tell her that her father's going to recover real soon, the Admiral stated. Sam Beckett smiled and placed his hands on the girl's shoulders. Your daddy's going to be well again. He is? Samantha cried. Oh, that's wonderful. Did Al tell you this? Angela asked. Yes, he did. Thank you, she said quietly. It felt like a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. Think nothing of it, little cherub, Al answered with a smile. He looked down at the hand link and then across to Sam. It's time to say goodbye. Dr. Beckett couldn't quite believe he was finally going to be able to leave the strange waiting room that lay somewhere between heaven and hell. He felt greatly relieved, but at the same time rather sad. Al's saying I have to go now, he said softly, and gave the beautiful redhead a kiss on the cheek. Then he gathered Angela up in his arms and hugged her tightly, to which she responded and did the same. Thank you, Sam, she said sweetly. You're welcome, honey, he replied, the tears beginning to show. Samantha noticed this and put her arms around the two of them. Good luck, Sam, she whispered. You too, he replied, sensing the energy source beginning to build up all around him. This always happened before the transition occurred, and would be followed by a feeling of being off balance while rushing back through the corridors of time and space. The blue and white lightning flashed before his eyes. It was time to move on to his next assignment. As the haze whirled away and feeling returned, Dr. Sam Beckett became aware of the sound of an electrocardiogram. Being a medical doctor, he could tell immediately the impulses were quite regular for a normal heartbeat. His eyes flickered open and he stared straight into strobe lighting. Oh no, not again, he moaned, blinking considerably. At that moment he became fully aware of his surroundings and let out a sigh. I'm back. In the hospital. I'm back? Andrew! The cry was one of total shock mixed with an overwhelming excitement, and it was female. Looking around, he focused on a young blonde woman seated next to him by the bed. Her blue eyes were full of tears of relief as well as fatigue. He smiled up at her and felt his hand being squeezed tightly by her own. Andrew, she cried again. I prayed and prayed you'd wake up. Oh, thank God! Sam lifted one hand and brushed away a lock of hair that had fallen over her eyes. Jennifer, he asked tenderly. Yes, it's me, darling, she replied, allowing the tears to cascade down her cheeks. She leaned forward and sobbed into his chest. Sam put both arms around the young woman and hugged her gently. It's okay, he said comfortingly. Jennifer, it's going to be okay. I'm here now. I wouldn't stop believing. I couldn't stop, she stammered, holding on to him. I know. That's why I'm here. He stopped for a minute, then added, Your faith brought me back, love. A whooshing sound echoed around the intensive care unit as the daughter of the future arrived, and Al stepped out looking delighted. "Oh, good, you made it back, I see." The quantum physicist noticed him, and while he stroked Jennifer's soft silky hair, nodded his head, indicating he wanted to hear the latest news update on the situation he was involved in. The Admiral positively beamed as he proceeded to press several keys on the coloured handlink. "Sam, this is great. Andrew makes a full recovery. He and Jennifer fall in love all over again, and they remarry a couple of months from now." A large smile spread across Sam's face, and he squeezed the young woman gently. In answer, she raised her head and kissed him lovingly. He responded to her touch and returned the affection. In a few moments they were locked in a warm embrace, their kissing becoming more and more passionate. "Don't you think you should inform the medical staff that that Andrew's recovered?" Al asked. He received no reply from either of the two, who continued kissing, oblivious to anyone or anything at that moment. "Well, I guess not right now. Maybe later, huh?" There was still no reaction, so Al summoned the door into the imaging chamber by tapping out a certain code on the handlink. "I'll see you later, Sam," he said, stepping inside the time hole that led to a different day and month, but the same year. Once inside the doorway, he turned around. "I'll go and see if Ziggy has any idea as to when you should be leaping. I mean, you've revived Mr. Lomax from almost certain death, so it looks like mission accomplished." Sam stopped kissing Jennifer. He looked over towards Al and the door and shook his head slightly. "It's not over yet?" Al said, surprised. "How do you know?" "I just know," Sam replied quietly. "You know what?" Jennifer asked, puzzled. Sam thought quickly. "I just know that I love you," he told her sweetly. She gazed deeply into his eyes. "And I love you, Andrew, very, very much." The physicist pulled her closer to him and began kissing her once more. "Here we go again," Al commented, whereupon he exited the room and the door closed behind him. That night Sam Beckett lay in the hospital bed after being ordered to rest by one of the doctors, Dr. Williams to be precise. Even though he felt fit and healthy, Sam had to try and remember that Andrew Lomax had been in critical condition. At any rate, Sam decided he did need to relax, since the whole strange experience of being trapped in limbo and then being sent back into Andrew's body had quite exhausted him. So he found it very easy to fall into a deep slumber. As he slept, he dreamt a whirling mist of blue and white seemed to cover his entire body. There were clouds racing through an evening sky as the sun was setting in rich colours of oranges, pinks and golds. Sam felt he was in a complete state of tranquillity as he travelled at great speed through the air. Was he leaping again? He wasn't quite sure. And if he was, then it didn't matter. Nothing seemed to be of any significance anymore. As he journeyed through space, he came across a dazzling light radiating warmth and comfort. The whole scene was so peaceful and serene. Suddenly he heard a voice coming from the centre of the energy source. Sam immediately recognised the tone and knew he'd heard it before, but he couldn't place where for a moment. Then it dawned on him. This was the same voice that had spoken to him whenever he was in between leaps. "I forgive you, Sam," it said in a soft, resounding tone. Sam Beckett pondered what he'd just heard. Forgive him? He kept asking himself. What had he done wrong? Apart from stepping into the accelerator chamber on the Project Quantum Leap, causing his soul to be lost in time, jumping from life to life. He realised for the first time that he'd gone ahead with the experiment without even considering how anybody else would feel if it went wrong. He'd been thinking of only himself when he took that fateful step. Maybe that was when he made the mistake. So as punishment he was chosen to live as a non-person, putting right what the times had made wrong. No, it wasn't exactly a punishment as such. It had taught him to care deeply for others, and he'd received a great deal of satisfaction when things did go right for the people he helped. It also taught him the valuable lesson of surviving. Most of his life he'd been distant and shy, finally shutting himself off from the rest of the world by hiding away under 150 feet of desert sand, like the proverbial ostrich, devoting time and energy to his projects in the hope he could conquer travelling in time. He'd never really experienced the true meaning of existence until he'd started leaping into the lives of other people during his own lifetime. Then a memory floated into mind. It was rather faded, but he could see himself condoning a friend from his past. He was only 10 years old, and the other kid had picked a fight with him on his farm in Elk Ridge, Indiana. He couldn't remember what the argument had been about, only the fact that he forgave his friend, even though the boy had been the one in the wrong. He recalled telling his mother about the incident. What had she said? People don't have the right to forgive. Absolution comes only from God himself. As those words formed in his mind, a sudden darkness descended upon him, but he felt no fear. It lifted, and he saw a silver mist cascading towards the earth. He looked closer and noticed it was made of thousands upon thousands of shooting stars. Their brilliance shone all around him, and he smiled, amazed and lost in awe at the sight. Sam's eyes opened slowly, but strangely enough he could still see the celestial light. Believing that he was still dreaming, he blinked several times. He realized he was awake. It wasn't a dream. When he looked into the brightness again, he became aware of the outline of a figure. His vision came into focus, and he saw it was a little girl standing by his bed. "Angela!" he cried, so overjoyed to see her again. "Is it really you?" Framed within a silver radiance, she gave the appearance of being an ethereal vision. She looked just like an angel. At first Sam thought it was a figment of his imagination until she spoke to him. "Daddy, I'm so glad to see you're well again." Crystal tears glistened in her eyes. She leaned over and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "I love you, Daddy, and I forgive you." Those final 3 words, spoken so softly, were overshadowed by another voice. Sam realised it was the same voice that accompanied him during his travels through the mysteries of time and space before he found himself occupying another person's body. He understood the words were not only for the little girl's father, they were for him as well. He reached out and took hold of her hand. Even though she was in spirit form, something allowed them to touch. Sam felt a ripple of emotion begin to stir somewhere deep inside. He sensed the part of him who was Andrew Lomax was finally letting go of the hatred he'd had for himself and the guilt he'd carried with him ever since that fateful day he'd accidentally caused the death of his beloved daughter. Warm tears began to trickle down his cheeks. "I love you too, Angela," he replied, full of compassion. Taking the little girl into his arms, he whispered softly, "Now you can be at peace, little one." As they hugged, Sam felt an overpowering wave of unconditional love flow over him. It touched his very soul, the element that was Dr. Sam Beckett. He knew it was time for the little girl to go, and so let go of her gently. Angela walked over to the centre of the room, her eyes full of tears, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of happiness. A sensitive smile came to her lips. "Goodbye, Daddy." Deep inside she thanked the Heavenly Father for giving her the chance to see him one last time. "Goodbye, honey," Sam said in a melancholy tone. He was sad to watch her go, but at the same time happy to know she was free at last. As soon as he'd wished her farewell, a brilliant light in the formation of twinkling stars cascaded over the little girl. It was like an illuminated waterfall as it showered down on her. Angela gave her father a knowing look. "Thank you, Sam, for everything," she said, smiling. "And please thank Al for me too," she added. His look was one of surprise. Then Sam realised she'd known all along he'd been sent to help her father to face life again, to love once more so the spirit of his daughter could ascend to an eternal paradise. "I will," he answered softly. "Goodbye, Angela." He watched as the beautiful shimmering waterfall covered the girl completely. The light became brighter and brighter, then it vanished without a trace, taking Angela with it. Dr. Sam Beckett lay back against a pillow, wiping the tears from his eyes. He glanced over at the space where the spirit of the little girl had been, but the intensive care room was now bathed in darkness. He pictured the wondrous vision he'd witnessed only moments ago. Had it all been real? He smiled contentedly because he knew the answer. Yes, he said quietly, it really did happen. For the first time in his life, the physicist felt completely at peace with himself. He wasn't even worried about leaping to his next task, now that he'd completed what he believed to be the most incredible experience he'd ever been a part of. It had taken him beyond the realms of existence and was something not even his Swiss cheese mind would forget. He had just closed his eyes so he could drift off into a tranquil sleep when a metallic sound made him open them. He noticed the room was partially bathed in light once more, only this time he knew it was coming from the doorway that led to the quantum leap imaging chamber. Al Calavici stood there, cigar in one hand, hand-link in the other, a confused look on his face. He stepped forward and the door closed behind him. Sam, it's all worked out as planned, but... He paused and pressed the keypad, causing the electronic bleeps to sound in various high-pitched tones. Uh-oh, he said, a little alarmed. Uh-oh, Sam asked calmly, staring into space. The expression the observer frequently used no longer seemed to aggravate him like it had in the past. Al gave a puzzled frown. Are you okay? The quantum physicist looked at his best friend and smiled. I'm fine, thanks. Then he thought about the little girl. Angela's at peace, and she wanted me to say thank you for her. The Admiral sighed contentedly on hearing the good news, then reverted back to the problem at hand. I guessed that because a moment ago I received news from Ziggy telling me you've completed your mission. So, can I leap? Sam asked, remaining in a composed manner. To tell the truth, he didn't really mind if he could or not. Well, that's the problem, I replied awkwardly. Ziggy doesn't know when it's going to happen. He took a short breath and continued as best he could. I mean, you should leap real soon. After all, you've helped 2 people, or should I say 1 person and a spirit, or was it 2 spirits? He was getting rather confused. Never mind, he said abruptly. What I'm trying to say is, Ziggy finds no explanation as to why you haven't leaped yet. I don't know why either, Sam admitted. All I know is it's not up to me, or you, or even the project, and Ziggy. The Admiral was even more perplexed, particularly at the way the quantum physicist was handling the situation. He couldn't remember when he'd seen Sam so calm. Then who? He asked. Sam grinned at the observer. It's up to him, Al. Who him? Then Al realised who Sam was referring to. Oh, you mean him? God. Exactly, Sam assured him. An idea entered the Admiral's train of thought, and he decided to put it forward. Maybe you can return to the project here in New Mexico. After all, you are in the year 1999. Sam Beckett hadn't even considered the possibility of going home. It seemed a nice idea, but something told him it could also be a dangerous one. But I'd be Andrew while he'd be me. Also, if we did meet, it would probably cause a paradox in the space and time continuum. I didn't think about that, Al replied. After all, it was Dr. Beckett who was the genius in the laws of science, not him. That's okay, Sam said. We can't all be masterminds in the art of time travel, he added with a grin. Al laughed in return. I guess not. Just then the door appeared, taking them both by surprise. What the... Gushy, Al yelled. Why have you sent the door? I never asked for it. When there was no reply, he tried again, but still received no answer. He began frantically pressing keys on the hand-link, but it was all to no avail. Gushy! Sam got out of the bed and stood up. It was weird, but he suddenly felt drawn to the rectangular block of light. He knew he'd been mentally coerced in this way once before, and he still didn't understand why he was being compelled toward it again. All he knew was he must walk through that doorway. The Admiral, absorbed in an attempt to find out from the hybrid computer just what the heck was going on, noticed his friend's movements, and it startled him. Sam, where are you? What the hell are you doing? He asked apprehensively. At that precise moment, the physicist entered the doorway, and it seemed to almost swallow him up. He became alarmed and turned to face the hologram of his friend. Al Calavici had been expecting the scientist to walk straight through it and back into the hospital. The door was, after all, only a holographic image like himself. Instead, he'd seen his friend almost vanish before his eyes. Sam! he exclaimed, completely shocked at the revelation. The quantum physicist quickly retraced his steps back to the Admiral. "Al, I can get through it," he said, surprised. A sense of déjà vu passed by, and he realised this had all happened before. He stared back into the light. "Oh no," he said anxiously. "It can't be the other door, the one that leads to that place between heaven and hell." Sam started becoming more fearful. "I can't go back there. It's not my time yet. Surely it's not." He looked at Al imploringly. The hologram checked the hand link for answers to this strange phenomenon. "According to Ziggy, the father you leaped into is going to still make a full recovery." He shook his head and frowned. I don't understand." "I'm not going through it," Sam decided. "I'll just stay here and maybe we'll go away," he said hopefully, taking a few steps backwards. Al's jaw dropped in astonishment when he saw where the physicist was standing. Instead of bumping into the object behind him, he'd walked straight through it. "Sam," he cried, "you're in the middle of the bed." "What?" Sam stared down and to his complete surprise realised what the Admiral was saying was the truth. At that moment the door to the future slammed shut, causing them both to jump. "What the heck?" Sam began, extremely puzzled. A squeal from the hand link cut him off in mid-sentence. Al looked at the little gadget and then across at Sam, still standing through the bed, looking totally baffled. "According to Ziggy, your body has vanished from the waiting room," he exclaimed in concern. "What? That's impossible," Sam cried out, alarmed. The Admiral thought for a moment. "Not unless—" A well-known saying, "God works in mysterious ways," had come to mind. "Not unless what?" Sam asked with concern, his scientific mind needing a logical explanation. Al prayed what he was thinking would turn out to be accurate. Still, maybe it was just a desperate hope. He took a deep breath, then reached out as if to seize Dr. Beckett's arm. To his and Sam's complete and utter astonishment, that was exactly what he did. "Gotcha!" he cried out as he felt his fingers close on solid flesh. Sam's eyes widened as the realisation hit him like a smack in the face. "Al!" he declared, excited. This is the imaging chamber." A sudden rush of emotion took over as he became aware that everything around him was now a hologram except his best friend. "I'm home." Sam almost choked on his words. "I've come home, Al." Tears welled up in the Admiral's eyes. He couldn't quite believe he was actually holding on to Sam's arm after all these years. He gripped a little tighter just to confirm it was actually happening and he wasn't hallucinating.
"Ouch!"
Sam said. "I forgot you had a grip like steel." The moisture was glistening in his own eyes and he sniffed, trying to hold back the tears. But it was no use and they began to trickle down his cheeks. "I guess God decided you'd reached your ultimate leap," Al said. He wiped his face with the back of his hand while the other remained firmly clasped around Dr. Beckett's arm. "Yeah, I guess," Sam replied, then looked above him. "Thank you," he uttered, sensing a feeling of sheer relief. Al Calavici flung his arms around the physicist and hugged him. "Welcome home, Sam." The two men remained where they were, so pleased they could at last occupy the same space at the same time. Then the Admiral released his hold and yelled with all his might, "Gooshi, open the door!" He winked at Sam, then added, "I've got a surprise for you, and it's a real doozy." There was a whooshing sound as the chamber door slid upwards. Tentatively, the physicist stepped through, followed by the observer. Once inside, Sam noticed a second sealed entrance at the end of a buffer zone. Slowly his memory began to return. He watched as Al started to punch out a combination on the hand link and stopped him. "May I have the pleasure?" he asked. The Admiral smiled and handed him the little gizmo. "There you go, but believe me, it's no pleasure." Sam knew what to do. He pressed the correct keys and the door opened, revealing the interior of the control room in all its shimmering and colourful splendour. Al indicated he should wait where he was, then stepped out of the buffer zone. Sam immediately recognised the watchful eyes of Gooshi, who was standing behind the multi-viewed table. Next to him was the psychiatrist, Dr. Verbena Beeks. Standing beside her was Tina, who greeted the Admiral with a loving smile. "So what's the surprise?" she asked, curious. Al looked at the head programmer. "Where's Donna?" "I think she's in her quarters," Gussie replied. "Admiral, what's going on? Is Dr. Beckett all right?" From inside the buffer zone, Sam grinned widely. "Oh, Dr. Beckett's just fine," Al assured his colleagues, then turned back to the little guy with the bad breath. "Get Dr. Elisi here, on the double." "Okay," Gussie said, surprised. He flicked a switch and made an announcement over the intercom. Several minutes later she appeared looking rather flustered. Then she noticed the Admiral. "What's up?" she asked, her face changing to a look of concern. "Is it Sam?" "Yes, it is," a voice said from behind the chamber door, whereupon the quantum physicist stepped out, much to everyone's amazement. "Sam!" Donna cried, whirling round to see where the sound was coming from. Without a word he walked over and gathered her up into a warm embrace. The memories came flooding back, and he now knew who she was. This attractive brunette was his wife, whom he loved dearly. Dr. Elisi lifted her head and gazed into her husband's eyes. "I knew you'd come back again. I just knew it," she told him, relieved he had finally returned. "Again?" Sam looked puzzled. The Admiral walked up beside him and decided to explain. "In a previous leap you came back to your own time while I was the one stuck in 1945. Dr. Beckett stared at him a little bewildered. "Huh?" Al continued to describe the event. "We simo-leaped, and in doing so changed places. Then you leaped back into the past and saved my life, but you couldn't get back." He paused briefly. "I'm glad you made it this time, Sam." "So am I," Donna replied, hardly daring to let go of him in case he vanished from her again. Dr. Beckett smiled at them both. Then he leaned forward to kiss his wife, to which she returned the favour. Both felt the passion that had been hidden for so long begin to flourish inside themselves, and their kissing grew stronger. The rest of the project personnel decided they too would show their feelings. They crept from around the coloured cuboid structure and walked over to the quantum physicist and his wife. "Welcome home, Dr. Beckett," Gussie greeted with enthusiasm. "Welcome home." Both Sam and Donna felt a little embarrassed when they realised everyone had been watching their public display of affection. Al noticed and grinned. "Oh, come on, you had every right to kiss the way you just did." He stepped up to Sam's lovely wife. "Don't I get one?" he asked. Donna smiled at her husband, who had a look on his face that seemed to say, "Trust him." Then she turned round and gave the Admiral a friendly hug. "Hey, what about me, Sam?" Verbena asked, whereupon he embraced the psychiatrist. "I'm so glad to see you again," she whispered. Tina tapped him on the shoulder to gain his attention and received a generous squeeze from him as well. Gussie joined in, and pretty soon everyone was hugging everyone else. "I think it's time to pop the champagne bottle," Al announced. He was given a pleasing nod from Tina, who came over and threw her arms round him, much to his delight. Donna returned to her husband's embrace. "I love you, Sam," she said softly, her heart filled with affection for the one man she thought she might never see again. Dr. Beckett knew fate had been kind. Now here he was, back in his own time, amongst people he truly cared about. One woman in particular meant the whole world to him. "I love you, Donna," he whispered, then kissed her tenderly. It all seemed like an incredible dream, but the miraculous thing was he really had come home, at last. As she held on to him tightly, Dr. Donna Elisi closed her eyes and prayed he wouldn't leave her again. At the same time, she was very much aware he was a scientist who would continue to devote himself to his experiments. He'd have to carry on with his work. It was in his blood, it was his reason for living. But would it be wise to continue with Project Quantum Leap? After all, she thought, as the saying goes, you shouldn't tempt fate twice. Dr. Sam Beckett, dressed in a white Fermi suit, made the final adjustments on the multicoloured panel that was the main part of the computer. Then he addressed his creation, eagerness in his voice. "Ziggy?" "Yes, Dr. Beckett?" The tone indicated the complete disinterest as to how her inventor happened to be feeling at that precise moment in time. "What's the betting the experiment will be a hit this time?" he asked in anticipation. "I predict a 52% chance of success," the voice replied. Sam sighed and rested chin in hand. "Well, at least that's better than last time. Okay, let's do it." Good luck, Dr. Beckett, Ziggy said with the same cool attitude. Thanks, I'll need it. Sam walked up to the door, which opened for him with a gentle whoosh of air, and stepped into the accelerator chamber for the third time. As he did so, he heard a familiar, deep, gravelly voice from behind. "Oh, no, you don't," Al Calavici said curtly. "You're not leaving without me. Not this time, Sam." He was wearing the same protective suit, and before the physicist could do anything to prevent it, the Admiral followed him into the chamber. Immediately the door sealed shut behind the two friends. As the energy field pulsated around them, Sam Beckett raised his arms and glanced over at the Admiral, who was copying his motion. "There won't be any more leaping this time," Sam assured him. "I've updated the process, and the calculations are completely correct." He smiled, feeling a rush of excitement mixed with nervous tension. "No more leaping," he repeated, closing his eyes. He had to be right. He just had to be. "Sure, no more leaping," Al replied with a hint of uneasiness. He couldn't help being rather sceptical, especially after observing the past 5 years. There was an almighty powerful surge of electrical energy as blue and white lightning flashed all around them. It glowed brighter and even more radiant with each second that passed. Then both quantum physicist and time traveller Dr. Sam Beckett and his once observer Admiral Al Calavici uttered those immortal words in perfect harmony.
"Oh boy."
The end.